Matt, now we're going to talk about some other stuff soon, but you are a Renaissance man and are interested in everything. When we saw each other at the forum a couple of weeks ago, you were telling me about your latest book coming out. And I know this is just a teaser for everyone, but I'd love for you to actually share a little bit about that.
Yes, I have a book coming out next week in the UK and 2 weeks after that in the US. It's called Birds, Sex and Beauty. And it's about evolution. It's about particularly sexual selection, which is the mate choice version of evolution, which Darwin thought was very different from natural selection, and I think he was right. And I call it the fun version of evolution, because whereas survival of the fittest gives you sort of utilitarian ways of getting through the world, seduction of the hottest can give you peacock's tails and flamboyant plumage and beautiful birdsong and some really quite eccentric ways of building animals. And one of them, just possibly, I hint at the end of this book, is that this is a better explanation for the sudden development of the human brain over the last few million years than natural selection. In other words, our brains got big very fast, not to help us survive, but to help us attract mates by endowing us with, music and poetry and wit and art and all these other things that we show off with.
So that sounds a lot like the Robin Williams exchange in Dead Poets Society, that we do poetry to woo women. Are you basically agreeing with that?
I'd forgotten that line. That's great. Thank you for that. Yes, I am basically agreeing with that. However, I should stress that the book is 90% about birds, and if you buy it trying to find out how an African ape evolved, i.e. us, then you'll be disappointed. But I do have a chapter at the end on the implications. But I just think it's a really interesting biological theory that has been somewhat neglected, that mate choice rather than survival, it drives an awful lot of evolution.
Now, evolution is a running theme for you, and one of my favorite applications of the concept of evolution, and also the concept of sex, but was your concept of ideas having sex that you talked about, where people exchange ideas with each other and develop new ones. I'm curious if you can share a little bit about that theory for everyone here who hasn't heard that before, and then I want to dive into that a bit.
Yes. I wrote a book called The Rational Optimist, and one of the things I was intrigued in is why human progress happens, why living standards improve, and so on. And it became very clear to me that the human habit of exchange, of exchanging ideas, exchanging goods and services, enables us to raise each other's living standards. And I'm very intrigued by the parallels between biological evolution and human innovation, technological innovation. And it finally dawned on me that actually there is a very precise analogy here between the role of sexual reproduction in biological evolution and the role of exchange in technological innovation. So in biological evolution, most of the ways that organisms come up with new traits, new features, is by mixing and matching their genes. So remixing, recombining genetic sequences. Now they do that through the process of sex. Basically you bring together two individuals and you select a section of the genes from one and a section of genes from the other, and you mix them together in a process called meiosis. And that's a very important part of evolution. And in parallel, the way we make new technologies is often to take two different ideas and put them together in a new way, to existing technologies, and recombine them to make a new technology. My favourite example of this is a thing called the pill camera, which is a pill that you swallow, and it takes a film of your insides, and that can be uploaded to the doctor. The invention of that came about after a conversation over a garden fence between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. Now, that's the process I describe as ideas having sex. Two really wildly different ideas that came together, met and mated, and had a totally new idea.
And that's such a great example of how new innovations can come about from this. But I think the idea applies to more than just technological innovations. It's also philosophies and the ideas that drive us. I'm sure you're familiar with Matt Collins' sociology of philosophies, and what he describes in there seems to be or actually, are you familiar with his book?
I've heard of it, but I don't know it well. So feel free to describe it in a way that I'll understand it.
So he actually has a similar concept for how philosophies evolve and become dominant over time. And so much of it, is, as he articulates it, really comes from just having the right people in the right rooms and communities sharing ideas with each other in order to improve them. And it's never top down. It's not just one individual driving this. It is having the setup for robust conversations to happen that lead to different philosophies in different places at certain time periods.
Right, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, I've often put it crudely and said, look, 100 stupid people in a room who are talking to each other will achieve more than 100 clever people who are not talking to each other. And there's a very nice example of that in the invention of the aeroplane. You've got Samuel Langley, the cleverest man in the United States, with a huge government grant, in secret building the first aeroplane, and in October 1903 he launches it in front of a crowd and it crashes into the water, and he is humiliated and the government's furious. And about 10 weeks later, on an island off North Carolina, two bicycle mechanics without a degree between them succeed where Langley has failed. Orville and Wilbur Wright. And of course what they're doing right that Langley did wrong is that they are picking the brains of other people all around the world. They're corresponding with Lawrence Highgrave in Australia, with Octave Chanute in Chicago, with Otto Lilienthal in Germany. So anybody who's done any experiments on gliders and box kites and wind tunnels and things like that, they're harvesting other people's ideas, they're putting together, and then they're doing a bunch of experiments. And I wrote a whole book called The Evolution of Everything, in which I argued that we are way too top-down in the way we interpret human history in all sorts of fields. Philosophy, as you say, but also education, morality, etc., etc. We think that a clever person is designing the solution. And a moment's thought tells you that that can't be what's happening, because, as Frederick Bastiat famously said, Paris gets fed every day, not because there's a Paris food commissioner, but because the market enables ordinary people to work out supply and demand. There's a wonderful quote from the Scottish philosopher Adam Ferguson, which is that, and this applies, I think, very well to language when you think about it, but it also applies to the internet. There are things that are the product of human action, but not the result of human design. And this is what he's getting at. He's saying, awful lot of what we create emerges from our interactions, but without anyone ever planning it. And so this is a really good way of getting people to understand how disastrous central planning can be and how successful just simple exchange of ideas can be instead.
Well, and not just a simple exchange of ideas, you're giving one of the most compelling arguments for free market capitalism, because it allows for people to be in conversation with others more, to develop better ideas on how to serve each other, and literally feed more people.
Yes, and I'm always amazed by the fact that our kids are educated into believing that the problem with capitalism is that it's selfish and involves no cooperation, just competition. And actually, when you think about it, that's crazy. There is enormous cooperation between the suppliers in the supply chain, between the people working in the factory, between the distributors, between the retailers, and then between the vendor and the customer. They are collaborating. It's a way bigger form of generous cooperation in which both parties benefit than anything you get out of government or central planning. I prefer to use the word commerce rather than capitalism these days, because capitalism tends to imply you need a lot of money to make this kind of thing work. And quite a lot of things, as we've seen with digital technologies, but also with virtual organizations and philosophies and things, is it's the exchange of goods and services and ideas that work, not the provision of large quantities of money that make these things work.
100%. And what's interesting is that the same principle also applies within businesses, not just with, say, a technological development like the creation of the airplane, like you described, but Steve Jobs famously designed the Pixar headquarters in a way to maximize engagements between people from different departments. At one point, wanting there only to be 2 bathrooms, one male, one female, so that people would have to run into others from different departments and different sides of the office, so they would talk with each other and come up with ideas that they couldn't plan on their own.
That's a fabulous example. I didn't know that story, and I've often slightly struggled with Apple, because it's a good example of an extremely successful company, obviously, but it has heavily depended on one genius person. So there is a great man theory of Apple, as it were, and also one brilliant designer in the shape of Johnny Ive, who envisaged this extraordinarily beautiful machine that I'm talking to you through, a MacBook Air, which I think is one of the most elegant devices ever seen. And I remember the moment when I first saw an iMac. Those very, very, sorry, you're not old enough to know what an iMac is, but it was one of the very first successful Apple computers they had a success, and then they nearly went bankrupt, and then they produced this thing that was blue and glowed and slightly translucent and had a handle on top so you could carry it around. And I remember thinking, oh, hang on, I thought computers were supposed to be utilitarian grey or black things. Somebody's trying to make this thing attractive. I never thought of that. So the whole Apple philosophy of putting design at the centre of it is in some ways a bit more top down, but actually it isn't, because it's as you say, it's getting people to interact. It's throwing ideas around. Johnny Ive was recently being interviewed, and he had lunch with Steve Jobs pretty well every day, so that they were just batting ideas backwards and forwards with lots of other people, and these systems of free human exchange are at the root of everything we've achieved as a species, and yet that's not what our kids are being told in school, that's not what students are being told in universities, and that's not what government departments assume. I get very frustrated. I've taken part in government conversations in the UK many times to try and improve innovation policy, and the bureaucrats and the politicians all want to talk in a top-down way. They all want to talk about, right, what winner shall we pick? Which technology shall we champion? And I keep saying, you don't know. Steve Ballmer, the chief executive of Microsoft, when the iPhone was launched, he said there's no chance the iPhone's going to get any market share. No chance at all. And he was completely wrong. So there is no expert on where the market's going next or what will happen next in technology. And those kind of lessons need to be remembered.
Well, this actually is a really good conversation to think about how business leaders can effectively utilize this skill, because the example I gave was actually Pixar, when Steve Jobs wasn't running Apple, when he was on the outs there.
You're right.
He set it up there.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely. But I think it applies to Apple too, because even though Steve Jobs was such a domineering force there with his vision for what he wanted, it's not like he knew how to create the iPhone. It's not like he knew how to create the iMac. He depended on so many other people to bring that to life, and it required so many innovations in what to do. And as you pointed out, a big part of his leadership style was just, even at Apple, getting people to talk with each other, talk across different departments, to share ideas, to develop ideas, knowing that he didn't have it all figured out. He may have had a sense for where to go and drove everyone to that, but he needed everyone else to work with him to figure it out.
That's exactly right, and and other great innovators are like that too. I mean, Jeff Bezos is famous for saying things like, if you're not swinging and missing, you're not going to invent things. If you're not communicating, if you're not getting ideas from the shop floor in your organization, you're not going to make progress. So I think the great innovators, and by the way, I think there's an important distinction here between innovators and inventors. Inventing a prototype of something is all very well, but making that available, affordable and reliable is extremely hard work sometimes. People like Thomas Edison, Jeff Bezos do that without inventing the thing in the first place, and they're just as important, maybe more so.
Now, I feel like I have to ask what you think that AI is going to do with the development of new ideas here, and whether us having a conversation with these LLMs now, or what might be developed in the future, will create not just technological innovations, which it clearly will, but just the potential for new ideas from us conversing with AI.
Well, the short answer is I don't know, and I refer you to the answer I gave a few minutes ago. Nobody knows the future of technology, and people who try and forecast where things are going get it badly wrong. And I think it's just as easy to be over-optimistic about AI as it is to be over-pessimistic about AI. To say it's not going to change the world at all would be ridiculous, but to say we're going to have artificial general intelligence and it's going to turn on us within 10 years is probably equally implausible. Somewhere in between those two poles, there is going to be a dramatic transformation of certain professions. I think the legal profession, the accountancy profession are in the firing line this time in a way that production line workers were in previous waves of automation. I think a general principle to hold in mind is that AIs tend to augment and assist human beings rather than replace them. That is to say, when we got sat-nav, it helps us navigate. It doesn't mean we leave it to the car to find its way home. And I think that driverless cars will be a niche product in certain places and times, but I think mostly what you're going to get is assisted driving, where it prevents you having accidents and all that kind of thing, rather than actually takes over. So I think those principles are worth remembering. I suspect it's important not to get carried away. I very much follow Roy Amara, who was a guy in the 1960s who said, we overestimate the impact of a new technology in the short run, but we underestimate it in the long run. There's a sort of S-shaped curve. Now, AI seems to be on the accelerating part of the S-shaped. AI is disappointed for most of my life. Remember in 1969, it was forecast we would have a malicious computer in charge of a spaceship by the year 2001. HAL. Well, that didn't happen 24 years ago. So, in many ways it's been disappointing, but I think it's now accelerating into something dramatic. And as you say, for someone who writes for a living like me, it's always been rather special that I know how to compose a sentence. I find it easier than other people. Well, look comes a machine that can do it instead and do it just better than me. This is really annoying. But what that's mainly doing at the moment, I think, is helping those people who struggle to write, rather than replacing the best poets or the best artists. But there will come a moment, as you say, where you can, and it's kind of already here, isn't it, where you can interrogate an AI to teach yourself stuff, and it will know more certainly than you do, and than any human being does, because it can harvest material from lots of different human sources. So I think it's. I don't think we know what's going to happen. I'm generally optimistic. I think the idea of these things turning malicious is far-fetched, unless we really force them to. We had that problem with computer viruses 20 years ago. We coped with that. It's a problem, but it's not fatal. So I don't think they can turn malicious. I think there will be downsides. Social media was going to be a lovely technology. It turned out to have significant downsides. I don't think we'd want to uninvent it. It's still got upsides as well. And I think that will be true for AI. So there'll be trade-offs. And I'm sorry, it's back to saying, I don't know.
But even if we don't know, we should still be optimistic. As you point out in The Rational Optimist, humans always find a way to persevere through, whether it's with AI or anything else. And Matt, I just want to say thank you for joining here. I love each one of your books, and actually did not realize that your new book on birds was going to have so much evolutionary theory to it. So I'm even more excited for that now than I was when you first mentioned it to me.
Yes, I told you it's just a book about birds, and actually it is. It was an excuse to go bird watching, but there's evolutionary theory in there too. Well, thank you, Alexander. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and it's kind of you to make the time.
That's really kind of you, Matt. Thank you so much.